speaker in the room is someone, and title of this speech is Practical Automation for Beginners. So please give a warm welcome.
Thank you. So in this session, we will be talking about practical automation for beginners. You can see the slides at this link over there. My name is So-won Yu. I'm a business developer from Redo, which is a business development firm. So I'm going to start off this talk by telling you who I am not. I am not a computer science major. I am not a developer by trade. I'm not that much of an expert in Python, nor am I anywhere near being able to say I know enough Python to be speaking at PyCon. Many of people think that this is the kind of profile that's needed to give talks about automation in Python, but that's not always the case. So this is who I am. I am a liberal arts major. I majored in English literature. I'm an employee of a professional services firm. I do projects such as market entry strategy, corporate strategy, project management, office development for my living. I am a beginner of programming in Python, and I'm actually a very avid supporter for Python, simply because it's very easy to start as a beginner. I also develop automation tools that are in practical use in different companies. So this talk is for people that are like me, people who are beginners in Python, people who work in non-tech oriented companies, the companies who like to do business the old-fashioned way, people who have to deal with mechanical tasks on a daily basis, and those who want to make a difference in their workplace and cannot stand inefficiencies that go around in the workplace. I'm sorry. I think there is a bit of a technical issue. Excuse me, can somebody help me up here? 저기 죄송한데 잠시 도움 좀 받을 수 있을까요? 네, 컴퓨터가 멈춘 것 같은데.
완전 프리시된 건가요? 그건 이거 닫았다가 한번 다시 볼까요? 가서 스크린을 일단 교체해 놓을게요.
네, 잠시.
신경 주세요.
Sorry about that. So to continue a little bit, so even if you aren't a complete beginner in Python, I think you might be able to enjoy this talk, since I'll mostly be talking about the practicalities in putting your code to actual use. So in today's session, I'll go over why we all need to give a try in automation, how to start automation projects, and some practical tips on how to succeed in doing it. So how many people in the audience have an office job? Any raise of hands? Any 회사원? How many people have to waste time doing boring tasks all day? I see a lot of hands. So when faced with our day-to-day jobs, no matter what our occupation is, you end up being sucked into some kind of manual data work that doesn't really add value to your personal development. It's the same for accountants, same for sales, and even software engineers. So what should we do about this? The answer is to automate the boring stuff with Python. And this is an actual book. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it, especially for beginners in Python. So how can we actually spot these opportunities? Here's a simple framework you can apply to your day-to-day tasks and figure out how ideal it is for automation. So inputs that come from a structured database are ideal for automation. Inputs that come from software data, websites, drop-down input forms, or fairly stable Excel files are something that can be easily automated. Some difficult inputs, which are difficult but not completely impossible to automate, are inputs from unstructured or unstable databases like long-form free text input fields or meeting notes. Some processes that are ideal would be the ones that are rules-based and objective, ideally have some kind of formal documentation on how the processes are done, and are perceived as a chore that is critical to be done for the wheels to go around, but it's not something that people enjoy doing. Some difficult processes are the ones that require subjective judgment, ones where human interaction is an important part of the process, and also some that include complex logic that may be interpreted from different people in different ways. If the output of whatever task you're thinking of has a low penalty for making mistakes, that would be easier to automate because you are bound to make some mistakes at first, and so it would be good if the penalty for making these initial mistakes are low. The difficult types of outputs are the ones that are where the output is mission critical and should be sensitive in conveying nuances, are outputs that need a high level of flexibility, so the outputs need to change all the time. And overall, if this process itself is repetitive and it is a routine task that you do every day, it would benefit more from being automated. So some examples of tasks that you can usually see in the workplace could include examples such as sending out a monthly executive report with the latest sales numbers, or sending a reminder email to employees who have to update their subscription for some kind of software service. Okay, so now let's say you have identified some tasks that could potentially be automated. What's next? To make real change in how you and your organization works, it turns out you actually have to convince your boss about this as well. Actually, some good news is that workplace automation is also beneficial for the whole organization and company. So let's say it takes 2 hours a day for you to complete a task. If you do this task for 7 days straight, then you would have spent 14 hours of time solely on doing this sort of manual work. On the other hand, if you had software that automated this, there would be an initial investment cost here. So this is the cost of developing the software. So this would be the initial time that you spend, or the resources that you spend in developing this. But when scaling this and doing this every day, actually the amount of effort that needs to go into it afterwards is less. We can even expand this further to think about a task that all of your colleagues have to do. So for example, if you have 5 colleagues that do the same 2-hour task every single day, once you have this software, you could be effectively saving 70 hours of you and your colleagues' time. Also, another point is that the time and cost to develop programs in Python is much faster than any other programming language that I know. This means that the initial development cost itself could be less, and that would even be more beneficial in convincing your boss that this is some kind of project that we should go after. So now let's go into actually starting an automation project at work. I'd like to add at this point that the libraries needed to accomplish basic automation can be at a very basic level. Tasks such as manipulating data, scraping the web, or managing files, which is the bulk of manual work that goes on, can be done with the knowledge of only a few key libraries that any Python beginner would start with learning anyways. So this is almost the full list of all of the tools, all of the libraries I used in developing automation tools that are actually in use in different companies. The point is, there is not a huge entry barrier to getting started with automation. Simple libraries can take you quite far very easily. So the most important part when developing automation tools that will actually be used is to choose the right scope. When approaching tasks that you want to automate, keep in mind that a smaller chunk of work is always better. It's easy to get trapped by thinking too big from the start. Who wouldn't want to get rid of all those pesky tasks that bother you at work with just like a press of a button? But the first step in connecting your idea to reality is to break down that task you have in mind and start from the easiest task first. If you want to automate a group of tasks, so this big circle here represents a group of tasks, you should start thinking about which task you should go first. Even when you have a task in mind, a smaller task, it's even better to start with automating only part of a task. A weekend project is always better than a week-long project in terms of getting quick wins and minimizing the possibility of failure. Always start with the low-hanging fruit as well. Choose tasks that are simple and straightforward. The more complicated the algorithms and assumptions you make on the way, the more likely it becomes that situations change and you have to discard the tool before you get enough use out of it. Choosing easier parts first will also help beginners apply entry-level programming skills to actually solve practical problems that you see in work. So as one instance of this framework, let's take a look at an example of automating only part of a task. In this case, the tool was for data collection as a subtask for generating sales leads. The group of tasks this belongs to would then be sales operations. I developed a simple web scraping program for screening requests for proposals, are also called RFPs. You can find the actual code in this GitHub link here. This is a simple script that runs on a command prompt, and it is currently used for weekly operations. So previously, it required an employee to manually look up predefined keywords and reorganize data from the government procurement site every week. So if you see here, if this is the home page that employee would have to go to, there is a small search bar here where they would enter a list of keywords that have been predefined. You'd get a list of all the different RFPs that are available. The employee would have to go and click on each one, which brings you to this kind of page. And at the bottom, you see there are file links that you have to download. So they would have to go click on each individual link and then organize all the files into their respective folders. So not only did this take long, the manual task didn't make it easy to do a thorough job of screening all of these 500 to 1,000 entries every single week in an objective manner. So this was a good candidate for automation simply because although it requires some human judgment, the process itself follows a predefined set of rules and the required data input is quite stable. So with the new process made possible by a very simple Python script, all that is needed is a one-time input of all the keywords you want to include, which is in this one, and all the keywords that you want to exclude from the search. And once the program runs, you would get an Excel file with all the possible RFPs already organized quite nicely. Downloading files is also done automatically by inputting the RFP code, which you can find right here, into a separate text file. This saved a lot of individual clicks in getting all the files in the right locations. I used 7 libraries for these, which can be found here. These are all very standard libraries, and most of them are already built into the basic Python. It took me 2 days as a beginner in Python to develop the first commit, and there were 25 incremental commits so far. But the point is that it was minimal effort from my part to actually develop something that's useful for the whole office, simply because the scope was so small. Now, let's see what happens when you try to automate an entire task prematurely. Last year, I got involved in a flight cost management project for a company that flies out their employees across the world regularly. One task that we automated was to create a weekly dashboard for reporting the flight cost control status. This was done with a step-by-step Jupyter Notebook documentation and script, and it took me 2 weeks to develop, but it was only used for 6 months. I'll tell you in a while why that happened. So this is how the tool worked. Python script was used to combine data from 5 different sources over here. And it provided a full picture of how flights were being booked, paid for, and actually used. The output of the script was an Excel file where the data was cleaned up, combined, and enriched. It detected duplicates or discrepancies between the data, and in addition added more context to the flight reasons, like whether or not the person missed their flight or not. This tool, of course, was very useful for the company because it reveals some best and worst practices in booking flights, and they could take corrective actions to save unneeded costs. However, the tool did not survive more than 6 months. Why do you think that was? Well, the main reason was because the tool owner that was responsible for running this every week actually quit the company. But the person that took over this role didn't have the time nor the motivation to learn how it worked and how to manage the tool from the start. If it were a more simple tool, for example, that combined only 2 databases, data sources, and cleaned it up, I'm sure it would have had a better chance of surviving this handover. However, since it looked like a kind of a magical black box to outsiders, the non-tech crowd was no longer sure if they could trust this tool or not. This is a case example to show what happens when you bite off a little too much than you and your organization can handle at once. Lastly, I will briefly show an example of a full-blown process automation project with a larger scope. This was a project to develop a custom project management application to automate communication within a shipbuilding company. It was a web application based on the Django framework, and it took 4 months and 3 full-time members to develop this. It is still in use, but it took an additional 2 months to training effort for user onboarding. So this company previously had to deal with a large amount of manual data that was captured in 20 different types of Excel documents. Since their processes were highly specialized and unique, they couldn't really use an off-the-shelf product management software. So we helped them develop a custom web application that could replace these 20 documents. My team built the tool for 4 months and then helped the onboarding process for 2 more months afterwards. But already you can see that this is way beyond the scope of a simple automation project for beginners. It is, of course, possible to consider automation at this scale, but the amount of work and support that has to go into it is exponentially higher than a simpler tool. So this was also built on top of numerous smaller efforts to automate manual tasks, so it wasn't something that we did overnight. So again, my advice to you is always start small. Always start with a smaller scope when you are beginning this journey. And who knows, it might become the basis of a larger project like this in the future. For the last part of the talk, I'll go through some lessons learned that I learned on the way of doing these types of different processes, and what I think are the kind of takeaways in how to succeed in doing this. So there are a few basic rules that I found useful when you're getting started with your automation journey. So first of all, as I've emphasized throughout my talk, keep it simple. Not only will this make writing the script easier, but it will also prevent too many bugs appearing afterwards. Also, simple tools are able to adapt to change more easily. There is always the possibility that you can build on top of whatever simple tools you have to later build a more complex tool. So think of them as building individual Lego blocks, which you can then combine later on. And for these types of complex projects, also note that you need to convince the right people and involve an entire team to really make a large effort happen successfully. Second, know your audience. Especially if you're working under a boss that doesn't know much about programming, it's important to make it easier for them to understand and not be afraid of using these tools. So one trick I found quite useful is to connect your script to more familiar tools. My go-to method is to prepare a script so you have an Excel input template and also an Excel output. Also avoid introducing technical elements to the end user too much. If it's possible, hide the technical elements like a command prompt or even Jupyter Notebook from the end user and make it a click and go system. Also see if you can minimize the initial setup that's needed to run your code. Lastly, document your code meticulously. Not only is it important to document how exactly your code works and how to run it, but it is also important to document the business logic behind the code, as well as any particular situations that may change in the future and affect your code. Of course, if the code is simple enough, many parts of the code itself would be self-evident, and so there may not need, it may not need so much extensive documentation. So again, making it simpler would make everything much more easier. But it is still important to remember to document, since it's something that we often forget to do. This type of documentation is especially important when a handover is expected. If, for instance, you've developed a code that many of your colleagues can find use for, they would need thorough documentation to understand how to use the tool as well. So now my message to you, as this is the end of the presentation, is to get out there and start looking for automation opportunities in your own life. And this is the end of my presentation. And before I go, I would like to briefly introduce the company that I work for. So Reddle is a global professional services firm offering business development as a service. The cases that you just saw are only part of a large range of problems that we solve for global companies on a daily basis. We are continuously looking to hire individuals from various backgrounds who love problem solving and thrive in a team environment. So if you want to solve some cool problems and don't mind traveling the world, please send us an email. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you.